Welcome everyone back to another live program here on our Teach Monticello channel. My name is Laura Cooper. I've been on here talking with kids for the last several weeks. And this week we're excited to be talking directly to you all as teachers, parents, educators, as fellow educators. One of my colleagues from the school programs team is going to join me. We have both given many a school program over the last 6 years that we've both worked at Monticello together, and each of us put together different programs for both students and teachers. So we're really excited to share with you today some of our favorite and go-to resources for teaching about the history of slavery and race and justice in our nation and our world, and how we approach that on site and digitally as we get to talk to students. So Carrie is going to join me on screen.
Hi, thank you, Laura.
Yeah, it's fun to get to do this. And you are back at work. I'm not essential today, so I'm still at home. But we're excited to be having these conversations digitally and to be able to do them in person again too, which is really exciting. Do you want to share a little bit about what you do at Monticello and your education background?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I, like Laura, I think we've been here about the same amount of time. And I love working in the school programs. And I also have worked in the digital capacity of school programs as well, which later on I'll get to tell you in a little bit more detail about, but helping to run some of our virtual experiences for students and teachers. And I did have a brief stint as a drama teacher for a couple of years. So I have worked with students from kindergarten all the way up to 8th grade, maybe even 9th grade. So I also have a little understanding of a teaching background as well in a classroom. But of course, as a museum educator as well, it's something that I know I share with Laura and feeling really passionate about, and grateful that we get to do this.
Absolutely. And we get to work together on the Monticello Teacher Institute for the last few years, which is one of our favorite things. And I know a lot of our alums are watching, and we're very sad that we don't get to do that in person this year. And that's where a lot of our knowledge about this has come from experientially, is working with other educators. We know that we in the museum field are just a little pocket of all of the resources that go into teaching hard history, honest history. But we're excited to talk about that with you all today. So, of course, Monticello, as the home of Thomas Jefferson, was also a plantation, and over 400 people were enslaved on the mountaintop, and more on Jefferson's other properties. And this is something that we talk about with all of our visitors from the very youngest. So I know in my experience, I know you've encountered this too, kids ask the most honest questions, and they're also the most open to vulnerable questions oftentimes. So tell me a little bit about how you approach talking about slavery with kiddos on your school programs.
Sure, absolutely. I think first and foremost, and I know we share this approach, being very aware of the fact that I am white. People assume that I'm white when they look at me, and we don't only educate white people. We have students of all backgrounds and all races who come here. And so I'm very mindful in not, hopefully not giving a white-centric version of history, especially to those super young, super impressionable kids. And I would say in my experience, they 100% understand fair. And that is how I approach it with them. I usually start with what is slavery, asking them. I really do that with any age group, but especially with younger ones, when they help to create a definition for it, I feel that it helps them better understand what we're talking about. And they get it, they know. And I think that it's really important that we give them credit, that kids really grasp concepts a lot faster than sometimes we realize as older adults.
And we talk about this a lot with our fellow school programs guides. We have a big team. And I don't know if you remember this, early this winter, we had a roundtable where we were talking about some questions that guides had fielded from students that they weren't sure where to start, because kids ask those really honest questions. So I know I've heard, was he nice to them, or did he hurt them? And how do you go about answering those questions?
Yeah, because those are really fair questions, and even adults will ask those questions, though in different ways, like, was Jefferson a good slave owner? I think it's important that we are honest with children, even when they're young, even when they're, I think probably the youngest school group that I have been able to lead around here on site is probably a first or second grade, but they're curious and they want to understand better what we're discussing. So I think it's best to answer them honestly, but definitely with their age in mind. Whereas if a first or second grader asks, was Jefferson nice to slaves? I can tell them that, well, how would you define nice? Like, let's talk about what nice means, and kind of go from there and really highlight the differences in how people were treated differently, and go back to that fair and unfair that they're going to understand so well. And especially students are curious about how slaves were punished. And of course, this is the institution of slavery. There absolutely was violence on this mountaintop. But our job and our goal is not to terrify children, but we could certainly, and I certainly do in my interpretation, explain that, yeah, slaves were punished and in ways that were really sad and really unfair and awful, and really focus on the, not necessarily like the whipping and what that would feel and look like, but answer them in an honest way that answers their question, but doesn't really, I guess, for lack of a better word, traumatize them too much. And I know we'll talk about how we talk to older students later, but I think honesty is great, just being mindful of their age.
And aware and honest about their emotional responses too, right? Saying people were hurt here, and that's really sad, because you can see it in their faces when they're asking those questions. And so honoring the emotion that they're coming to it with, and that's a valid response. And as you were saying, kids can take in that information and process it. And so being willing to say that wasn't okay, and that wasn't fair, and there was no such thing as a good slave owner, and just telling it straight with them, and they can process that in an age appropriate manner. And one of the books that we wanted to share with you all today is called My Name is James Madison Hemmings. Carrie has it with her since she's got access to the office library. And the first page of this book is actually a really beautiful definition to start with and start exploring with students. It's beautifully succinct. And part of what I like about this book is that James Madison Hemmings did write a memoir of his experience growing up at Monticello, enslaved as the son of Sally Hemings, but also knowing that Thomas Jefferson was his father. And so I'll read what the first page of this book says. It says, slavery, when one human being owns another human being. To the owner, the enslaved person is often no more than a piece of property, a sheep, a horse, a quote, slave. But each enslaved person has a name, a mother and a father, and a mind, a heart, and a story. And I love how this even explains the importance of language in talking about slavery and enslaved people. Carrie, do you want to explain this shift that's happened over the last several years to you, rather than just saying that someone was a slave, we talk about them as enslaved people?
Yeah, absolutely. We use enslaved when we're talking about enslaved cooks, because we want to give the enslaved people who we are sharing their stories agency. They were their own people. And just as what Laura read from this book, My Name is James Madison Hemmings, they had names. They had jobs. They were not, while their life as an enslaved person absolutely impacted who they were, who they could and could not become. They're not just a slave. And so we use enslaved instead of slaves. Of course, when we talk about groups of people, sometimes we'll use slave, but you'll absolutely hear us use that terminology. Same with names. When we know, we're really fortunate to Jefferson was such a detailed record keeper that we really know a lot of names of the slaves that lived and labored here at Monticello. And so when we do know their last names, we absolutely refer to them by both names, such as James Hemmings, and not some of the diminutive names in which Jefferson referred to them. For example, someone named James might be named Jamie, but within their own family, they would be called James. So we would call James Hemmings, giving them their identity, which is something that the institution of slavery was absolutely trying to strip from them.
And this is another huge part of the conversation of our work is recognizing and sharing the agency that individuals had, even under the realities of slavery. And so we can talk with students about how they still took care of their families and spent time with their families and took care of one another and had extraordinary skills and brought African culture to the United States through food and music and objects, and share that history with them, rather than it wanting to share that full picture, right? So we're talking about the realities of slavery, but we're also talking about the triumphs and the work done by enslaved people on their own behalfs, right? So this is that's really the theme of the other picture book for young readers that we wanted to share with you guys. And this is called Henry's Freedom Box. And this one is not based at Monticello, but it is another excellent story of pursuing liberation and freeing himself. And hits on really one of the most salient points of the enslaved experience, which is the fear of separation from one's family and the importance of family in the enslaved community. And so that's another really excellent book. We'll be sharing all of these online later on, but educators, parents, if you have other books that you love, resources that you love, please share those with us. And we would love to have those so that we can continue learning. And I know that I've been doing a ton of reading in the last few weeks. There's always more to learn. And I came across this quote earlier today from Clint Smith. He was doing a webinar for facing history and ourselves. And it's never infrequent that Thomas Jefferson pops up in these conversations, even if it's not directly about Monticello. And so he said, we must teach our children to reckon with competing truths. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence and also enslaved his own children. And I've had kids have this exact moment on the mountaintop. I had one young man on a tour. I think they were probably 3rd or 4th grade. And we were grappling through this concept of slavery. We'd actually had to sort of pause and talk about it again because I realized there were some misunderstandings that we'd been having. And he looked at me very sweetly as he was processing and goes, so Jefferson was a good guy and a bad guy. So he was a medium guy? And I love that so much. And I always want students to just grapple with the significance of both, right? And that's so important. But that also points us to another piece of the story that we talk about with all of our guests, and that's the story of Sally Hemings. So Carrie, do you want to talk about how you approach that topic with students?
Sure, absolutely. It is kind of similar to what we were talking about with younger students and their questions. Again, trying to be as honest, but also age appropriate. And in all ages, we all understand the concept of family. And even younger students understand that family can be super complicated. And so while it might be hard for them to grasp, as Laura was describing, some of the different facets of Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, but also had children with a slave, and therefore he enslaved his own children. But when they're really young, I will approach it as Jefferson had another family after his wife died, with a slave that he owned named Sally Hemmings, and I will name their children, and I will tell the students, that because they were slaves, and at this point in the program, we've already defined what slavery, or made our definition of slavery. I'll ask them, where do you think Sally Hemmings and Beverly and Harriet and Madison and Eston Hemmings lived? They've been, they're listening. They get it. They will quickly say, not in the same house as Jefferson. They'll point to the slave cabin or something like that. And when they're younger, comparing and contrasting is really helpful too in helping them kind of get the story. But with older students, we can delve into more depth of the story. Laura, I know that you had an experience. Was it with an 8th grader that really was processing this story in some pretty impressive ways?
Absolutely. It was a moment for me that really encapsulated how much things have shifted even in the last 5 years or so in the conversation. So in the before times, in the pre-pandemic times, spring at Monticello was defined by hundreds and hundreds of middle schoolers coming on tour. And they are always on trips that include many historic sites. They've absorbed a lot of information. And I've come to love those groups because if you can build that rapport and engage them in a conversation, middle schoolers will tell you exactly what they think and ask the most honest questions. And so I had shared with them the story of Sally Hemmings and this separation between her children and Jefferson's children by his wife, and asked them to ask whatever they were thinking. And I had one young man ask, was there consent? And it was a really exciting moment to see him have that word in his vocabulary and feel like he could ask that, and we could have a real conversation about, okay, let's think about the situation here. Jefferson was 30 years older than Hemmings. He owned her and was one of the most powerful men in the world, while she was a Black woman owned by him. Within this legal system. And consent isn't even a concept that makes sense in that narrative. And yet also looking at the agency that Sally Hemmings took over her own life to speak up for her children and advocate for their future freedom. So sharing the work that she did on her family's behalf as well. And we got to have that conversation in the parlor of Monticello, and that's really cool. And it was a really exciting moment.
It also makes me think of what we were talking about earlier with younger students grappling with the unfairness of slavery and the feelings that brings up. And that really, acknowledging feelings is something that we do with all ages, students of all ages, even adults, is that just like thinking about defining slavery, that makes us feel bad and awful. Talking about whatever the connection between Jefferson and Hemmings was also brings up feelings. And it's also good for us to acknowledge that with the students. Because in some of these, like, we don't have a definite answer for them, but we can create safe space to discuss it. And I would encourage the teachers and educators and parents watching that, this is hard history, and we acknowledge that it is hard to approach, especially if it's not something that you have experience with. But just having conversations and acknowledging that it's uncomfortable is a great step. And creating that safe space to really process it. We do that ourselves here with our colleagues at work, because like Laura said, we're always learning, and we're always learning how we can better improve our interpretation, especially with school groups as well.
Absolutely. And another topic, so all of these different hard histories are wrapped up in each other. So there's slavery, there's the history of consent and sexual abuse, and then there's also the history of race. All of these things are interconnected. And race is something that is, again, easier to go deeper with in terms of the complications of science versus social realities with older students. But Carrie, you have a great method of talking about race with younger students without falling into the trap of color blindness.
Yes. I mean, when discussing slavery in the colonies in the United States, you cannot not talk about race, because it was race-based slavery. You know, a lot of the students that we get to interact with on site as well as virtually have experienced racism in their own young lives. So it's important that we talk about it. And so with younger student groups, I really want to drive home the point of, in a way, of how absurd the concept of race is. We know that it's a social construct, that it's a made-up idea that we should be classified this way. But at the same time, race is very real because racism is very real. And so one of the ways that I approach talking about race and its role in slavery that we're discussing is I will have us on site when we don't have to socially distance. So we'll see how this works with socially distancing now. I ask the students to all put their arms out in a circle with me, so we can see all of our different arms. And I'm very enthusiastic, and I say, oh, look how beautiful we all are. And I'll notice, and we all look different. And I have old skin that has freckles, so I always use myself. And I'll say, oh, I have freckles, but student A next to me doesn't. Does that make me better than her? And again, kids get fair. No, right? And I'll say, oh, well, she doesn't have freckles and I do, so does that make her better than me? No. And from there, we can talk about how ridiculous the idea that our different appearances make us superior or inferior to each other. And from that conversation, we can talk about how, even though we know it is ridiculous, it was a real thing that happened. And it happens today, too. So in our looking at the past, we're also able to use that to bring history forward, which I know we'll talk about shortly, the legacy of slavery. But I found that tiny little activity is powerful with kids because, one, it's a reminder that our skin is all beautiful, and it doesn't make us better or worse than each other. But that people were treated like that, and so much so that people were decided to be property or not property. But as well as today, where people are definitely treated differently, all based on how they look.
That's a really accessible way to start that conversation with students. And it's another place where honoring students' feelings and opinions and reactions to the intensity of the topic is so important. So we see it with younger students, we see it with older students, that they can have very valid, very negative reactions to Jefferson specifically, or being at a plantation site. And that's fine by me, right? And it's not about, I don't need them to love a particular historical figure. I want them to examine the positive and the negative and the significance, right? How does this influence us today? And you were just pointing towards that, towards the legacy of this history. Of course, tomorrow is Juneteenth. And I know you'll talk about that in a moment, but I often approach talking about legacy with students through the lens of the Declaration of Independence, which of course makes sense for us with Jefferson as the author. And what we often talk about is Jefferson's ideas of civic liberty and religious liberty and education being applied to people Jefferson never would have considered or imagined or thought worthy of receiving those and enjoying those liberties. And I've asked students, I think, of every grade level, is everyone treated perfectly equally all the time today? And they know the answer is no. And we can talk a little bit about what we can do to make the world a better place and how they can engage and what they can participate in. And so I often frame it through those different lenses of what does this look like politically? What does this look like in education? How has this been used in different places in history? And students know about the women's suffrage movement and the movement for LGBTQ rights and voting rights throughout the years. And so they know the answers and are ready to have that conversation, and that's really exciting. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how you approach legacy with students and Juneteenth as well?
Sure. Yeah. I also, as we all do, use the Declaration of Independence, and I will pick out the phrase, often having students quote it right along with me. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I'll go over men. If I am on a virtual program, I can pull up a slide to show them the famous Trumbull painting of all the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And I will ask students to make observations about it, because very quickly they will note that it's all white men. It's all men, right? Sometimes the younger ones notice that they're all wearing wigs, right? But the point being is that this super important document, one that we still look to and draw inspiration from today, when originally written, was not inclusive. It really did mean men, and it didn't mean all men. It meant men like Thomas Jefferson, white men in positions of power, property owners. And so I will go over that with whatever, age appropriately, but with whatever group of students I'm speaking with. But then also, instead of leaving them, I'm kind of a blah feeling about it, bring it forward. And as Laura noted, they are familiar, right? They've hit these big points in our short United States history. And we are very fortunate to have lots of props and visuals that we can use on our on-site programs as well. So we have a timeline of people who have quoted the Declaration of Independence. So I can pull out Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King Jr. And students will recognize. And I'll ask, all right, so what did he mean when he quoted all men are created equal? And then even bring it all the way forward to say, okay, so today in 2020, if we say all men are created equal, what do we mean? And again, it's making them part of that, of defining that. And it very quickly gets to, we mean all people, and we mean all people aren't just created equal, but they should be treated equally. And then I'll pose the question to them, how are we doing on that? As we've been saying this whole time, kids get it. I don't know if kids always get the credit that they deserve. And they quickly get like, oh yeah, no, we're still not there. And to inspire them, right? That we can work towards making that phrase true for all United States citizens. And I think I've forgotten your question, Laura. That's one of the legacies, I guess, but also definitely, as I mentioned before, in talking about race and race-based slavery and racism, is acknowledging events, current events, before we closed to the public during the COVID stuff. On site, older student groups, I'd be able to discuss with them the events in Charlottesville in August of 2017, because they would be familiar with it. I mean, Charlottesville was a hashtag. I think it probably still is in relation to that. And that gives an opportunity for me as a guide and interpreter to really show how the legacy of slavery is prevalent today, because racism is still prevalent today. And we've been offering our virtual programming this whole time, even when closed to the public. The students, even young students like 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, are talking about what is going on in our country right now in relation to what we are talking about with them, this difficult history. And I think it is, a great time, especially for parents who are feeling motivated to have these conversations with their kids. This is time to do it. Because it is, as Laura said, it's all connected. You can connect the legacy of slavery to racism, but you can also connect how our country even began with protesting and to what is happening today as well. So yeah.
Awesome. And I think the other part of the question was Juneteenth, but I think you answered it in spirit, right? Because the celebration of Juneteenth is a celebration of emancipation and celebrating through education too, right? Celebrating by learning. So there is a list up on the main Monticello website of Juneteenth events, both in person and virtually. Our colleague and friend Nia Bates will be presenting again, so you can catch that too. But on that point of education and engaging as educators, I know you have a few more books with you that you wanted to share, and I have some books as well, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I encountered Jefferson's Sons through school groups that we, I guess you probably can't see the author's name, but because teachers were having either on-site visits or virtual visits, because this book is told through the lens of the Hemmings sons of Beverly and Madison and Eston Hemmings. It is historical fiction, and I must admit that at first I was a little wary of it because we have no idea if Jefferson had conversations with his Hemmings children. We know from Madison Hemmings' interview, he says that Jefferson didn't show them any really fatherly affection. But other than that, we don't really know what conversations went down, most especially with conversations Sally Hemings would have had with her children. But this is actually a great way to have these conversations with your students or your children about slavery, about the whole complicated family thing we were talking about how Jefferson enslaved his kids. They were slaves until they they became adults and were freed, and what happened to them after they were freed. One of the stories woven into this is Sally Hemings talking to her children about passing for white. And that is definitely something that we address in our slavery programs here, because we know that Beverly and Harriet Hemings, as much as we know about them, they kind of fall off the radar around the DC, maybe even Baltimore area once they're free. We assume that they decided to pass for white, and they probably could have, based on a description of Sally Hemings by another slave, that she was described as mighty near white. Another way that we can talk about race and race-based slavery with students. With Madison and Eston Hemings, we know that Eston Hemings eventually decided to also pass for white and changed his name from Hemings to Jefferson. And so I think that I would say late elementary, middle school is definitely the target audience for this. Other things that happen in it, I don't want to spoil it, is they experience friends being sold to other plantations. So there's that whole separation of families. And when you read it through the eyes of a child, it really drives home how powerful, awful that would have felt. So another good conversation you can have with your students or with your children. So I definitely would recommend this but definitely remember it's historical fiction. Please. But I cannot, and I'm sure you guys see this. Laura's going to hold up her copy too. It's the remix though, because she had the original. But Jason Reynolds is an awesome young adult author. He also has other stuff. And then, of course, Ibram X. Kendi wrote Stamped from the Beginning, which I definitely recommend. Laura's going to talk about this a little bit more, 100% for educators to read. But this is they call it the remix. And it is a great book. I love so much that Jason Reynolds said, this is not a history book. Even though as I'm making my children read it, they're like, this is totally a history book, Mom. But it covers the history of slavery, the legacy of slavery, the history of Black citizens in the United States, the history of the fight, the continued fight for equal rights in such a tangible way, and in a way that I would say middle, maybe upper middle, and high schoolers definitely could consume easily. And if you are not a book reader, I also highly recommend the audiobook. Jason Reynolds reads it. And it's super engaging. Like I could not turn it off, even though I had already read the book. So, but it's another great, like, for example, this is forced family read this summer. So I try to have conversations with my kids about the things that it talks about. And it talks to them. It's not a dumbed down version at all, but it speaks to kids on a level they understand. He refers to video games. He speaks in a language that is maybe a little less academic than some harder, thicker books are. So those are definitely two more of our book recommendations.
And I love having that variety. I think that an accessible way to look at something that can be overwhelming is so important. We talked about that all of the time when I was in education school and talking about how do we do this in classrooms and in informal learning settings like a museum. So I highly recommend Stamped, as Carrie does, but Stamped from the Beginning, which is sort of the full version, and he's brought it full circle as well. His other books, How to Be an Anti-Racist and the very brand new Anti-Racist Baby. So you can get really the whole set at this point. But this one is sort of the deeper, more academic my quarantine read. And I think this is well worth it for educators to have that full experience. And he does such an excellent job of tying together the threads. I think it's very easy to lose track when in a survey course, like so many students are in middle and high school, where you're covering everything from Jamestown to modern day in a school year. It's easy to lose the threads of how slavery and racism connect through and echo through American history, and he keeps those threads running, and it's you can see how it all connects. And some of our other favorites around the office, sort of as reference books, are the series Understanding and Teaching. So this is Understanding and Teaching American Slavery, and the introduction was written by Ira Berlin, who was a leading American scholar on the history of slavery. And this is actually a piece that we share with our teachers who come for the Summer Teacher Institute. This is required reading. The foreword is required reading before they take a Hemmings family tour on site. And then another resource we will, of course, share is Teaching Tolerance, which is an extraordinary organization that we've worked with. And one of our friends over there, Hassan Jeffries, edited the sequel, Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement. So these are both great educator resources to utilize as well. So with all of those are things that we recommend. We are going to put up a full list of books, and I hope that you all have shared additional recommendations with us, and will continue to do so. And those will go up at classroom.monticello.org. Carrie, we should link again to the Declaration of Independence timeline too, because that's a great one.
Yes. Laura, while you're sharing those books, it also struck me or reminded me that another reason that we really recommend these books is that this is making a huge generalized statement, but I'm going to stand on it, is that the United States history that is taught in our majority of our school systems is very white centric. And we are not just a white country. We need to have a more inclusive history. And that is what all of these books, even the picture books, can help you do with your own children or your students. So I just kind of wanted to add that to all the wonderful things that you said.
I could not agree more. Teaching hard history, teaching honest history is teaching a full history, right? Teaching the entire story so that all of the pieces make sense together. And rather than it being about honoring or memorializing, it's about remembering and learning.
Yeah.
And that's what we get to do together every day, even when it's virtually. So Carrie, you help coordinate some of our digital learning options for distance learning. So can you tell us about those two programs?
Absolutely. For about 2 or 3 years now, we have done what we affectionately call around the office electronic field trips. It has one of our Monticello educators uses slides and Google Street View online tour, like a virtual tour that you can click through. And sometimes we even have props. And we have offered those to students and teachers for free. We have one that focuses on Jefferson's Monticello, and one that focuses on the history of slavery at Monticello. And we have done them globally, reaching parts of Africa, Europe, South America, even Australia. We have a little tough time reaching Asia because of the time difference. It's so hard to connect. But we'll see what happens. And this year, just a few months ago, we launched a brand new digital program, and that is our live virtual tours. We just started those in mid-March when we closed to the public. And that is an opportunity for people to experience a live guided tour through parts of Jefferson's home, as well as parts of the property outside. So it's sort of an overview of life at Monticello, including stories of the enslaved families that lived and labored here as well. Those presently have just a small connection fee and are exclusively done through Zoom, but we have done a bunch of school programs. I think at this point we've reached maybe 10 different schools that were supposed to come on site, but couldn't when everything closed. And it's just, these are great interactive tools and resources for teachers, but also for families too, who want to learn along together, or even for homeschooling families. Because in both of these programs, we interact with the participants, whether they're typing questions in the chat box or getting to ask their questions out loud. It's just a great way to continue that connection with people from all over.
And I know we've both gotten to have some of those great, honest conversations with students digitally through those programs. It's a lot of fun, and a lot of them used to happen in the office you're sitting in, and my desk is on the other side of the wall. So I've heard many of those conversations and gotten to enjoy sort of students' honesty and the sort of the magic of those moments. And of course, now that you're there today, we should say again that we are reopened to the public. And part of that experience is a station specifically for families outdoors, where other members of our team are engaging in these conversations with kids of all ages. And there is also an outdoor station specifically about slavery at Monticello as well. And both of those fit into a tour or into a visit. So Electronic field trip information, live virtual tour information is up. We will be listing all of the books we've mentioned on our classroom website, and all of the various teaching tolerance resources that we love are listed on our live stream page as well.
Laura, can I make a short plug for the, I know I mentioned the audiobook of Stamped for those who either might have long commutes or don't have time to read. I get it. There is, I think we're adding a link to the podcast of Teaching Tolerance called Teaching Difficult History, which is an amazing resource for educators, but also a resource for parents. Parents, don't hesitate to listen to it, because it's not just about you helping your kids have a more inclusive understanding of the history of the United States. We need to learn that too. And it's so well done that I cannot recommend it enough.
I absolutely agree. Thank you for highlighting that one. Again, I wanted to make sure we hadn't missed anything. So you are. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and for all of the colleagues who have made this happen behind the scenes and have made it possible for you to join us and step away from frontline operations today. And we're excited to keep this conversation going. So please reach out to us with questions or more resources that you want to make sure we're aware of. And we look forward to continuing to support educators and families however we can, and continuing to learn and share this history with visitors of all ages.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
Thanks, Carrie. Have a great day, everyone.